All right, so we're going to be going over section 3, which talks about macroeconomics for the Econ packet for Academic. And so we're going to begin our discussion by talking about, well, what are the approaches and methods of understanding economics as a whole, just like in physical sciences. So we know that biologists study operations for specific models and types of data, and the same is true for economists who are trying to study larger systems. So they might study smaller things, and scientists can also study bigger ecosystems. So, in the same way, we can look to understand an entire economy as a whole. So, this is where macroeconomics comes in. So, we might say we want to look at how much is an economy producing, what causes national unemployment rates to fluctuate, and we use different models and data overall in order to understand, okay, well, we have these specific markets, and now we need to look at, well, how are national economies holding up? And so we want to look at two questions, and those include the factors that determine the long run growth in the size of economies, the standard of living that they provide to their participants, and the price level. And then the second issue is the causes and consequences of short run fluctuations in the level of economic activity, unemployment, and inflation. So we have these issues and concerns of, once again, the two factors are long run growth slash standard of living slash price level. And then the second question is causes and consequences of run fluctuations in the level of economic activity, unemployment, and inflation. So we're thinking economic activity. How is the actual activity of the economy happening? Or how much is it happening as well? And then how about those who are unemployed? How does unemployment fluctuate and how does inflation fluctuate? So that's very similar to price level. And so we want to start by looking at evidence that this can actually help motivate our analysis of looking at aggregate. So that means all things put together, economic indicators that try and show what is the performance of an economy as a whole, an aggregate economy, an economy as a whole. And so there are some measures such as gross domestic product or GDP, the cost of living, and the unemployment rate that all show aggregate economic indicators. And so we can see that these show the state of an economy and economic policy that is in place. And so, if we know how they're defined and interpreted, we can better understand behavior in the economy as a whole. And so, we first have to develop this theoretical framework in order to understand all economic performance as a whole. And then we need to begin describing factors that determine the size of an economy in the long run. So we need to understand what are those factors that are going to increase or decrease the size of an economy in not just the short run, but in the long run. So we can talk about down here, we were talking about, okay, well, what are the short long run fluctuations in the size of economy, standard of living, and or short run in economic activity, unemployment, and inflation, and then long run in size, standard of living, and price level. And so we see that we can start talking about factors that determine that size of an economy. Then we start to look at the causes of short-run fluctuations in an economy as a whole. So let's begin by talking about macroeconomic issues. So we first need to look at, okay, why is it important to understand the performance of national economies? And so we can look at a few aspects that have to do with the US economy first. So over time, the US has shown that it's very remarkable for its long history of growth. So, for example, from 1900 to the present, we have grown in gross domestic product or GDP again. And this, if we're going to define it, is the total quantity of goods and services produced in the economy. So, and we also adjust to remove the effects for inflation. So that's real GDP, is it's adjusted so that we're seeing a number of actual growth and not just showing inflation happening. So we can see in figure 30 here that the US real GDP has gone from like right here, which is probably right around, I want to say 500,000 millions of uh dollars of 2012 dollars specifically. So remember, this is adjusted for inflation so that inflation doesn't play a factor here. And we've grown up to almost 20 million US real GDP. So that's a very, very large increase. So since just about 1940, we've grown 10 times the economy, growing all the way up here. And then since 1900, we've grown up to 40 times our original, almost there. And so if we look at this, we can see that how is output measured? We're going to see it later. And so the total real output of the US economy has increased by a factor of nearly 40. There are some small declines and ups and downs that are notable from 1929 and 1933, which was the Great Depression. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about when would a decline most likely happen. 1929 to 1933 was when the Great Depression happened. And then we had an expansion in output. If you can see that little bump right there, this right here, and then this right here is what we're talking about here. We can see that there was a jump because of World War II from 1941 to 1945. Now, if we look on a bigger scale, this doesn't show much of a growth at all. However, we must understand that what we consume is limited by what we produce. So, one big idea of why do we want to raise the level of production in the first place? Well, it's usually because of the growth of population. And so, more people can produce more output, and so we produce more. But output overall has grown a lot faster than population. So how are we outputting so much? Well, the answer here is that, well, I suppose we'll get to it because first we want to understand, well, how do we know that the overall output per person has increased? Well, we look at the GDP per capita. So that's the average output per person. So since 1900, the average output per person, it has increased by a factor of 9. So overall, 9 times more. And so we call this GDP per capita, where per capita is the Latin phrase meaning per head, and it's used to denote averages for an entire population. And not only are we looking at an average output per capita and seeing what a typical person can consume, we can also see what an average person can produce. So output per capita is how much can be consumed as well. Whereas the average labor productivity, which is shown here, is the total output divided by the total number of workers. And so that's average labor productivity. And so if you notice, this is pretty much the same as GDP per capita, which is the output per person. And so we can see if we go down to figure 31 here, output per capita versus output per worker. So it's not the exact same as GDP per capita because GDP per capita is per person versus average labor productivity is per worker. And so that is the main difference between average labor productivity and GDP per capita. So we can see in figure 31 that the output per capita has gone up from this amount, which is probably like $7,000. It's gone up to about $58,000. And then with output per worker, we have more because not everyone is a worker, not everyone is employed here. So we can see that the average output per person, so that's GDP per capita, was over in 2019 was over 65,000. And if we're trying to look at this from a broader perspective, we can see that figure 32 shows United States and a bunch of other countries. And so there's a large variation in production per person. So even though even though the population is 5 times as large as the United States, China's production is only two-thirds of that of the United States, while its per capita output is only about 15% as large as the US. And so the smallest GDP per capita are those in South Asia and Africa. India is catching up to wealthier countries, but it only still has an output per capita of 3.2% of that of the United States. So remember, 15% was China, and two-thirds was the total GDP. So if we're looking at a bunch of GDP and GDP per capita, we can make some observations here. So looking at the US, we see that its GDP is the highest out of any of these, and then the next is China. So we know that as of 2019, we had $21,427 billion in GDP. And then China had 14,342.9, which is a two-thirds. And then if we go ahead and look at per capita here, we have United States has here 65,280.7 per person in the United States. And we can also see there's index numbers here that show us, okay, what are the percentages out of the US GDP and GDP per capita. So we can see, for example, that Germany has the next highest GDP per capita, whereas China has the next highest overall GDP. Because remember, just GDP is not adjusted for the size of the population, while this one is adjusted for the size of the population as a whole. Oh dear. Let me erase that. And so we can see, oh, I'm just going to go ahead and clear all my drawings. We can see that, for example, in China, the GDP per capita is actually quite low compared to other countries, even though its GDP total is much higher. And that's because its population is greater and therefore they can have a larger workforce. But we can also consider, well, there must be other factors going on because even though China has a greater population, the US has both a higher GDP, even though it has a lower population, and higher GDP per capita by a significant amount. And so we can see some patterns here in the charts that Germany seems to be the next highest in both GDP and GDP per capita as compared with the US and China. And then next up would likely be India here, which is just about, or sorry, I completely skipped out on Japan. We have Germany is the next up GDP, and then we have Japan here, which is next up after United States. Germany is third place, and then fourth place appears to be India. So it seems as though Japan actually has quite a significant index here, which Germany actually has the higher per capita index. And so we can see there's 70%, 61%, and then for the total GDP, however, it's significantly lower. And that's because, well, population is going to be lower than what is required at this stage for it to be higher. So overall, we can also see, I'm going to actually go back to this chart. We also see that in South Asia, so let's see, what did it say? It said those particularly in South Asia and Africa. So we have South Asia here. If we're looking at some of these countries, we have India, which is South Asia. However, they've grown a lot more. And then Africa. So, like, if you see numbers here like Nigeria and Egypt, and if we take a look at those, we see that they're significantly lower in GDP in billions as compared to the United States and Ghana. We see this is the lowest. Ghana is the lowest. And the lowest GDP per capita is Pakistan. And so we can see here that overall these are the trends in GDP. So uh, even in the US, Japan, Western Europe, there are a lot of people still living in poverty. But because they live in a country that has a high GDP, then they can actually enjoy access to those material goods that are in their country that far exceed all of those uh, consumption possibilities as those listed in Figure 32. So, uh, overall, if their GDP is higher or even their GDP per capita, that's giving them more opportunities, even the impoverished people there. Now, of course, it is noted that human happiness depends on more than just consumption. It, of course, means living a long and healthy life, education, and a cleaner environment overall. But we can see that usually material resources actually allow for these things: longer life, broader education, better healthcare, and a cleaner environment. So we see in Figure 33 GDP per capita and other quality of life indicators. So if we can see here, this is pretty important. We can see that, for example, uh, where is US? The US is right here, and we have our GDP per capita right here, 65,280.7. And then we have life expectancies here. So the highest is going to appear to be 84 years old in Japan. They have the highest life expectancy. And also note, currently on this chart, the lowest GDP per capita is Pakistan. And then we have the lowest life expectancy here is going to be 54 with Nigeria. And then we see that the highest adult literacy rate is 100, although we don't have reports for other nations with Russia here. So Russia has the highest adult literacy rate. And then we have the lowest literacy rate is in Pakistan, which is 59. So GDP per capita and adult literacy rate in Pakistan are lowest. And then internet usage, same thing. Pakistan is the lowest, but the highest is actually South Korea here. So we've got the highest and lowest, which will be really useful for understanding and memorizing. So overall, we can see how these relate. Typically, lower life expectancies seem to be associated with lower GDP per capita, although the US actually has kind of a middle of the road life expectancy here, and yet we have the highest GDP per capita. But we can see that Pakistan here is the lowest for all three of GDP per capita, adult literacy rate, and internet usage. So we can see that each of these show quality of life. And then if we want to look at total output, we see that the rate of output growth has increased. It's not steady. There have been periods where we have more rapid growth and slower growth, or even decline. And so we could see the decrease during the Great Depression or even the increase during the Second World War. So if we're looking back at 31 here, we can see that the rate isn't like a constant line here. It's growing or the rate itself is growing at which we are growing. And so we can see that we can also see the recession in the 2008 financial crisis here. So if we look at 2008, there's a dip right here. And so let's go back down. And so each of these are given specific names. So we can see that a period of between a trough and a peak, so the lowest point and the highest point in economic activity, is called an expansion. So an expansion is when we are expanding from a trough to a peak, from a lowest point in economic activity to a highest point in economic activity. And then we have between a peak and a trough is a recession. And then this recession, if it's very severe, then it's called a depression. So if something is decreasing at a very high rate, for example, then that might be called a depression. So 1929 to 1933 was the most severe episode of economic decline, and it's called the Great Depression. So these fluctuations between expansion and recession is called the business cycle. And so one of this is one of the main parts of macro econ. Uh, and so we see that usually periods of recession are associated with declining employment and slower wage growth. We can see that one of the focuses of macroeconomic policy, so how do we influence policy for a nation as a whole, is to try and reduce the severity and duration of recessions and depressions as a whole. So next up, we're going to begin a discussion on unemployment. So unemployment rate is a percentage of the labor force that would like to find work but cannot find employment. So please note, this is all the people who are seeking work who cannot find employment. This does not mean that a person who may just not be seeking work and just sitting back and doing nothing is not part of that labor force. And so the labor force makes up all individuals who are employed or unemployed. And when the unemployment rate is high, that means that it's harder to find work, and people who have jobs generally find it harder to earn promotions or increase their pay. So when there's unemployment rate high, it's hard to find work. They have harder times getting promotions and they can't increase their pay as much. Figure 35 shows unemployment rate since 1900. So if you go ahead and look at US unemployment went from 5% to in during the Great Depression, remember 1929 to 33. It spiked up to almost 25% here. And then it dipped back down to just balancing around 5%, going up and down and up and down. And there's where we can see some business cycles going on here. And so if we go back up to this unemployment, we can see that with the Great Depression, other there is an high unemployment rate. And then there's also some other key points about unemployment rate that figure 35 shows. So first, it's the idea that unemployment rate is never zero. So there are always people in the market who are searching for work no matter what. And so this shows whether there's new job seekers or um, there's different industries that get better or worse in the economy. And so even if there are expansions in the economy, there's bound to also be some companies that are closing while others are growing. And so there's this cycle up and down here. And even during the Great Depression, there were a lot laying off their workers, but there was also some that were expanding their workforce. And so even though there have been lots of changes in the economy since 1900, the it's clear that the unemployment rate isn't increasing in the long term, at least since 1900. And then we get to take a look at inflation. So we see that prices of individual goods are very important for individuals who are choosing to make choices in markets. And with a rise in a price of a gallon of gasoline, for example, it shows the consumers that they should reduce their consumption. And this means that this creates incentives for suppliers to increase production. So if the if the price goes up, then that means less people are going to be wanting to buy it, but more people are going to want to supply it with higher prices, remember. But when all the prices rise together, this is called inflation. And so all the things that people are consuming is becoming more expensive. And so inflation overall, it reduces purchasing power. So the power you have to purchase an item, it's being lowered because say you have like a single dollar and inflation causes that dollar water bottle to be now $2, then you have lower purchasing power now because that dollar can only get you half of a water bottle now instead of a full water bottle. And so we can see that it makes people worse off as a whole. And so this also imposes economic costs. Um, and so it's important to keep inflation low as a whole. Figure 36 now, if we take a look at that, we can see it is the inflation rate since 1900, and it's clearly varied over time. So if we take a look at figure 36 here, this is the inflation rate here. So we could see that right after 1920, there was a dip. And then right after 29 and all the way through 33, there was a dip. Note that dip happened at the Great Depression here. So we saw that there was a deflation in prices, but overall, we've seemed to have a lot of different cycles here in inflation, and we can also see some major peaks around this time period, which was World War II. We can see during these years, then we had an overall increase in inflation rate. And so we see how that's happening. And so we can see that overall, the price prices since 1900 have generally increased, but there have also been times that the price fell. So with a positive inflation rate, that means prices are increasing. Even if it's a negative inflation rate, there may still be higher uh, a higher price than previous years if the inflation rate hasn't gone down as much. And so we can see during the Great Depression, a price level fell, and then also price levels fell in the 2008 crisis over here. So if we're looking right there, that is some deflation there. And so then we get into international trade. And so how does it work when different national economies decide to trade with one another? So we know because the United States can produce so much for itself, as we already know, its GDP per capita is in 2019 65,280, which is very high, and our output overall is also very high. We don't rely on lots of other smaller countries, and generally in international trade, it's increased since the 1950s. Over the past few years, the level of exports and imports as a share of GDP, so remember, GDP is that total output of the economy, and exports and imports as that piece of the little GDP pie has actually fallen in the US. And so we see in figure 37 the volume of exports from the United States to other countries and the volume of imports to the United States since 1929. So if we go ahead and look here, figure 27, we can see that right around here is when our imports started to exceed our exports as a whole. And we've seen a couple um, other times, like during World War II here, and generally they've fluctuated, but now in the present, generally, we've been in a state of imports as a whole. So our when we have exports that exceed imports, that means we are running a trade surplus. So we were exporting and therefore taking in more money, and other people are buying things from us more than we are inputting, so more than we are buying from other countries. Now, if exports are less than imports, then the country is running a trade deficit. Now, overall, in a long-term scale, imports and exports usually move in similar ways, but there have also been shifts in their relative levels. So, up until the late 1950s, the US generally exported more than it imported. So, generally, until the late 1950s, the US it was exporting a whole lot more than we were taking in and importing. But since the 1970s, our imports are greater than our exports. So we could say the United States, up until the 1950s, was running a trade surplus, but since the 1970s, we have been running a trade deficit. Okay, so next up, we get to talk about macroeconomic measurement as a whole. So we saw in the previous section how the US economy is seen through the lens of total national output, inflation, and unemployment as a whole. And if we try and construct measures that capture that overall behavior of the national economy, it means that we're trying to put all of the overall behavior into one thing. We're trying to add all of them up. That is what aggregation is. And so aggregation is a combination of many things into a single economic variable, as we said. And so this can help us see a bigger picture, and we don't have to look at the obscure details, the small. Um, Now, this does mean that we don't get to look at the important details that may be small and obscure, but overall important. Now, if we can figure out a way to appropriately aggregate a lot of different economic concepts, then this can help us understand behavior in an economy and what the behavior of certain members of the economy shows. And so we're going to first look at how do we put the most important macroeconomic variables into aggregate, and what are they and what is the significance of them? So we saw earlier data on growth of the total output of the US economy. But how do we actually measure this total output is the question. So how do we add up haircuts, personal computers, fast food, hamburgers, so forth, all of this stuff that it's listing here? How do we add up everything that we've ever outputted? And the answer is, as we said, gross domestic product or GDP. The formal definition, this is very important for GDP, is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country during a specified period of time. And so we can see here that during a specified amount of time, we have a market value of all the final goods and services produced within a country. So we're going to go through the different parts of this definition here and explain as a whole what all this means. So let's start about what is the market value. So how do we find the market value of even an individual item? Well, we take all of the dollar values of all of those goods and we add them up. So, for example, an economy that only has t-shirts and shorts. If we have t-shirts selling for $5 and shorts selling for $10, then if the economy has a basket of 100 t-shirts and $5 each, that's $500, and then 25 pairs of shorts and each selling for $10, that's 500 plus 250, which is $750. And because we use market prices, the higher priced goods are contributing more to the total GDP. And so we can see it's market prices reflect the value that each marginal consumer places on the good. So if the goods have higher prices, then there is a higher value to the consumers, and so it should produce more total output. This is logical things that if something costs more, then clearly it's of higher value. And so it's going to contribute more to this market value idea in GDP, and thus $750. The 25 pairs of shorts is contributing relative to the t-shirts, contributing more to the GDP, even though there's more t-shirts being produced. We have $10 for every pair of shorts. If there was only one t-shirt and one shorts, then $10 out of the $15 that would be contributing to the GDP, and the shorts would be contributing more. Next up, we're going to talk about what are final goods and services. So we understand what the value is now. Now we need to understand, okay, what goods are being included in GDP. And so we know that there are a lot of different things that have to happen in order for us to be able to consume a lot of different products that we have. So automakers make purchase steel from refiners, who in turn purchase iron ore from a mining company, and the automobile is at the end product of this chain of purchases. We count up only its value in GDP, and we exclude the purchase of inputs that are used up to produce the car. So all of those uh, inputs that have gone towards the car, such as the iron from the mining company, those are called intermediate goods, the goods that are going towards the production of another good. And those are not included in GDP. We only do the final produced goods. And so if we exclude these intermediate goods, that ensures that our measure of GDP, it's not affected by the extent of vertical integration in the economy. So it's not measuring how many steps are we taking in order to make all the goods. Instead, it's showing how much the actual good that's being made is going to be produced. And so we can see that this will make sure that some goods won't have double the value just because they had a lot more production steps. So let's say that a steel producer it sells $200,000 worth of steel to an auto manufacturer, and then the auto manufacturer converts it to $1 million worth of automobiles. The steel is clearly an intermediate good because it went towards those automobiles. And now, let's say instead the automaker decides, no, actually, we're going to make our own steel and then sells the $1 million worth of automobiles. If in both cases the steel is included in the value of the automobiles, the $1 million, but by excluding the $200,000 that the original company had sold the steel for, then we are saying that no matter who owns the industry, no matter whose hands are touching it, we're going to have the same end goal, and that is that we're going to have that same GDP no matter what, of industry or ownership. And so, uh, goods can be either final or intermediate goods, either way. So let's say Sylvia raises tomatoes and she produces $200 worth of tomatoes, and she sells $100 worth at the farmer's market, and then she uses $100 to sell for $200, 100 to make tomato sauce, which she then sells for $200. This contribution would then be $300 because she is selling the $100 worth of tomatoes. It's an intermediate, or it's not an intermediate, it is a final good in that case. But then the other $100 of that goes towards producing the tomato sauce, which is worth $200. So we then add the $100 worth of the final good of tomatoes and $100 worth of the final good of tomato sauce. And so we get $300 in total GDP. And we don't count that extra $100 that went towards the tomato sauce, because then in that case, the tomatoes would be an intermediate good to the tomato sauce. Then we have the idea of capital goods, which actually don't fit into either intermediate or final goods. And so these are goods that are used to produce other goods and services but aren't used up. So, for example, like a machine or a factory building, they just for the sake of being consistent with our measurements, economists have decided that these capital goods, these goods that are not used up in production but are used to create things to produce, they are included in GDP in the year that they are produced. So, we also would want to make sure that these are included in GDP still, because if we didn't have them, then they wouldn't be reflected in the GDP and overall. We want to show that investing in the future, uh, by building this capital equipment, because if you build a factory, you're investing in what are you going to be able to make in the future. We want to be able to show in GDP that uh, there there was a contribution to GDP in that year that they produced the capital good. And if we didn't include it, then it would appear that the GDP is actually lower than it is, rather than an economy that maybe used all of its resources to produce consumer goods instead of investing in the future with capital. Then we have within a country. So notice we're going through this sentence very, very detailed. We've gotten, oh, apologies. The market value, we've gone over market value of all final goods during a specified period of time. So we now get to talk about during the specified period of time. So we only include the items that are fully produced in beginning and end to the period. Usually they include GDP, or they calculate GDP in amounts of time that are either annual or quarterly, so either every 12 months or every 3 months. And so the sale of goods that are produced in earlier periods are not included in GDP. So those goods that have already been produced in a different year, if you sell that, that doesn't contribute to GDP more. So, for example, a 20-year-old house sold this year for $150,000 would not be included in GDP because it was produced 20 years ago. And so, since it was already included in the GDP when it was produced, we don't count it again, even if it changes hands. Now, if we added an extra fee, such as a 6% commission, as an example here for like a real estate agent, this $9,000 fee is included in GDP since the real estate services the agent provided were produced in the current year. So if we are adding a service to that house, then that is going to be included in GDP as a whole. So now that we have a good understanding of, well, what is GDP? Now we need to understand, well, what does it actually measure? And so this was developed by in the 1930s. However, the first, the earliest known idea of, hey, let's go measure some total output was by Sir William Petty in the mid 1600s. It was part of the British government's effort to assess the ability of the Irish people to pay taxes to the crown. So, I am a British person, and I would very much like it if the Irish people, they pay their taxes, yes. And so I am Sir William Petty and I want to measure this because, I don't think that those Irish people are actually paying their taxes that are due to them. And so me here in the mid 1600s have I have decided that I will attempt to measure national output here in the great land here of Britain, you might even call it Great Britain, because it is just simply so great. And so we can see that not only was there this attempt, but there was also the attempt during the Great Depression to actually commission an economist to develop a system to measure national output. And so the man named Simon Kuznets, was commissioned in 1932 by the U.S. Department of Commerce. So, Department of Commerce, thinking about trade here, commerce is trade and dealings with the economy. Simon Kuznets reported to the U.S. Senate in 1934 about his idea for being able to measure national output as a whole and Then, as the US entered the World War II, this allowed for more perfecting of techniques of measuring the output and the data collection tools that uh, are needed in order to estimate GDP as a whole. So World War II allowed for the development of more of perfecting techniques and establishing data for GDP. So it might ask you what most influenced the uh, perfection of the techniques for collecting GDP. It was the Second World War in the US. Then in 1971, of course, Kuznets received the Nobel Prize in Economic Science for his contributions to measurement of national production. Then these concepts were refined by other scholars, and these reflect the practical value of these concepts since they kept being used. But despite their usefulness, they have a few limitations. So it's not always, so we're going to go over what those limitations are. So the first one is that it's not always easy to determine what constitutes the final goods and services. So the treatment of expenditures on national defense is a clear difficulty in GDP. Kuznets himself pointed out that they might be viewed as an intermediate good that allows for citizens to enjoy their final goods and services. So usually national defense is included in GDP or all the goods that are produced for national defense. But this might be considered an intermediate good, and so there's a limitation there. Then there's also the limitation that it's it's excluding any of the goods that are not bought and sold in markets. So, for example, unpaid household work. And so in the house, there are typically people who will housekeep or childcare that isn't counted toward GDP. But if in the market they are purchased, then they are included. And so this will make a little bit of an underestimate in the GDP because um, so an example of how this might have changed GDP is how a lot more women over the past 60 years have entered the paid labor force. And so more commercially available childcare and house cleaning has increased, and this has caused GDP to rise as a result because more people are in the formal market of childcare and house cleaning. But even though there is an increase in GDP, that doesn't mean that there was an increase in total production because beforehand just wasn't a uh, there it was just non-market activity of childcare and house cleaning. But since it has shifted to market activity, it reflects in GDP, even though it doesn't show more production, even though the same thing is happening, it's just in a formal market now. Then the third limitation is that it ignores those activities that deplete the country's stock of natural resources or pollute the environment. So, how much is the environment too being impacted and it could impact future results? And even though a lot of economic theory, remember, we're talking about the equilibrium quantities and prices shows the value of certain goods, but uh, actually measuring the value of goods is a lot more complicated in understanding. Um, so there aren't these reflections of how much are you depleting the resources of the nation. So remember, the three main limitations of GDP are difficulty constituting final goods and services such as national defense, the exclusion of goods not bought or sold in formal markets, and then the third limitation is that it ignores the depletion of resources and pollution of the environment. So, next up, we are going to take a look at other ways to measure GDP as a whole here. So, this next section is where we're not just talking about all of the goods and services that are produced, but also how they are purchased, and thus all of the expenditures, all of the ways people are spending in a country also can measure GDP. And so we can think of different purchasers into a few broad categories. So those include households, firms, the government, and the foreign sector. So that would include all of the foreign purchasers, all those people from other countries that are buying products from us or domestic products. And so each of these are considered a category of spending. And so household purchases, so people in a normal household, these are called consumption expenditures or consumption for short. And these are divided between consumer durables, non-durables, and services. So let's define those. Consumer durables are the consumer goods that last longer, as you would assume durable means. And so things like automobiles, washing machines, and furniture are all consumer durables. Now, expenditures in new houses are included in investment rather than in consumer durables. So we're later going to talk about what is investment. Then we aren't talking about consumer durables if we're trying to make a house better, maybe to sell it, for example. That's considered an investment and not a consumer durable. Now, consumer non-durables are those goods that are very easily used up. So food and clothing. And then we have services, which are things like education, legal services, insurance, and financial services. So all of the jobs that someone might have from a household are services that they are providing to people. So they might provide education or they might provide legal services, insurance, and financial services, which are all things that come from the household here. Then we have spending by firms on final goods and services. These all comprise investment. So we can subdivide that just like we divided the household. We can divide investment into the three categories of business fixed investment, residential fixed investment, and then inventories. So business fixed investment includes factories, offices, machinery, and equipment for business purchases. Then purchase of new homes and apartment buildings is called residential fixed investment. So we have business fixed investment and then the residential fixed investment. You should be able to distinguish these because the businesses are investing in things versus residential fixed investment is where different people are investing in resident homes. And so then we have the inventories, which are all additions of unsold goods to company inventories. So if we are using this idea of consumption and investment and all of this expenditure approach, as we'll get to later, if we say that expenditures equal production, then we can say that all the unsold goods that are added to company inventories are uh, considered part of the GDP here. Now, investment is clearly different in the eyes of an economist versus the eyes of just a normal person using the word investment. So we would usually use this to describe purchasing financial assets such as stocks or bonds, like making an investment. And this transferring ownership of already existing financial or physical assets that don't create new assets, um, they are not included because they are not creating new assets, which is what GDP here is measuring. And so investment is reserved for the purchase of new capital goods, such as buildings or equipment. So if you're buying something new, then that's going to be an investment, unless you're from the household, with the exception of housing, which is residential fixed investment. And then we get government purchases, which is all of the goods and services that are purchased by the federal, state, and local government. So all government. This is including government purchases. And so we uh, also include like wages that are paid to all the government employees, such as firefighters, teachers, and purchases of fighter planes for the military. So all the money that's going out of the government is considered government purchases. And additionally, governments make transfer payments, such as Social Security benefits. And these actually are not counted in the government purchase of goods. And interest paid on government debt is also not considered counted in the government purchases of goods. And then we finally get to the last section, which is net exports, in which we have the difference between the value of domestically produced goods sold to foreigners. So exports, as we explained earlier, minus imports. Net exports is just exports minus imports. And so we also see, okay, if you're purchasing foreign goods as a domestic buyer, domestic just meaning in the nation, then you are importing, so it's exports minus imports. And so GDP can be summed up as C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government purchases, and NX, which is net exports. So overall, we have this new method of calculating GDP. Next up, we're going to look at another way to look at GDP, and that is when income equals production and thus equals expenditures. And so we can think about GDP as income as well as the production and the expenditures here. So the combined income of labor and capital, that equals expenditures. And the this also equals production. And so GDP equals production, which equals expenditures, which equals income. And so we're going to take a look at the income of labor and capital, um, the income of labor and capital as a whole. And so we're going to look at different designations of a nation's GDP. So let's start by talking about real GDP. So this, how we get real GDP is by adding up all of the value of the goods and services produced during a specified period. And the size of this is, it depends on the quantity of goods and services produced at their prices. So quantity and price multiply there. And so we also can look at level of economic activity. Economists like to look at this between different locations. And so we want to be able to separate the effects of changes in prices from changes in the quantities of goods and services produced. So we want a way to see, okay, how much is being produced versus how is the price changing overall. And so we can see in figure 38 here in the top, we can see that there is a difference in GDP. And so we can see that for just two goods in 2 years, between 2015 and 2020, the GDP tripled, rising from 750 to 200 or 2,250. But if you see that the output of both t-shirts and shorts has only doubled, so it would have been $1,500. But because the prices overall increased by 50%, the GDP tripled, while the physical volume of the production doubled. So we want to be able to distinguish this quantity here, this quantity change, if we went from 100 to 200 and 25 to 50, we want to be able to show, okay, there was a two times, not a three times, because we can see that this illustrates an increase in price levels as a whole. Oh dear, I keep scrolling too far. And so we can see that we can easily isolate the effects by just looking at the total um, doubling of the quantities. However, in a lot of other cases, we can see that some quantities may be increasing and others are decreasing, and prices will also not change in a consistent way. And so, how we measure the effects of changes in production from the changes in prices, how do we estimate, well, how much is actually changed in being produced based on the price? We use real GDP. So, real GDP is used to isolate the effects of changes in production from changes in prices. So, isolate the effects of changes in production specifically. And so, this uses prices from a single year to value that production in each year. The year that we're basing it on is called the base year. And so, the example here is in figure 38, where we're seeing 2015 as the base year, and we can calculate the real GDP of 2020 by taking the levels of production in 2020 and multiplying the 2015 prices for each good. So the real GDP in 2020, for example, we have here, oh my goodness, we have the price here of, let's say, $15 and 7.50. Then we multiply, or apologies, other way around. Price of $5 and $10 and multiply by the new quantity, 275 here. And so we are isolating the changes specifically of just the quantity. And so we can see if we were to do uh, this chart here, $5 times 200 quantity and $10 times 50 quantity, we here have $500 times 1,000 or plus 1,000, which is this 1,500, which is the real GDP. And so this gives us our real GDP. And so we can see that overall, if we use where we see production is not growing at the same rate for different goods, we can multiply the each of the prices by the quantities. So each of the new prices by the quantities of the base year. And so we see if we use those new quantities from the, I'll just circle them because this is easier. Quantities from the new year, prices from the base year. And we get right here 1750. And so that is going to be our real GDP and what we call the inflated GDP in a way. It's called the nominal GDP. So all the GDP that's calculated with the current year prices is the nominal GDP. So we see that in 2020, it's 2,625. And then if we go ahead and see the increase in real GDP, it's 2.33. times the amount, which means that is a somewhat more uh, increase of about two products uh, per price. This is an indication of the two products increasing by that that amount of production. So we can see, or that factor of production. So that 2.3, see how the quantity of each based on these prices, right? So we have overall, you can see that this is going to influence the quantity increase overall. So three times the amount versus two times the amount and the quantity as a whole. But we can see that with these increases, the real GDP is 2.3 times the amount of production. So if we then try and measure inflation, what the US Bureau of Labor Statistics does to calculate this is uses the Consumer Price Index for each individual month. So the Consumer Price Index is looking at this idea of a market basket, and this market basket is meant to represent what a typical consumer is going to consume in an economy. So it doesn't always include all of the goods and services in an economy, but it does usually include what a typical consumer is going to have. So we're trying to look at what is the cost of purchasing this market basket of goods. And so in order to uh, figure out the CPI, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, it conducts periodic surveys of customer expenditures where a certain sample they take of households, they carefully record all of the expenditures they have, and then all of these responses are added up or aggregated to show the typical amounts of goods and services purchased each month by each of these representative households at different income levels as well. So they're trying to get representative of a population and in different parts of the country to show differences in the consumption patterns all across the board to get that typical consumer. And so each month, BLS employees also visit stores, check websites, and collect actual price information, which actually does include the temporary discounts that retailers offer. And then, and this includes for the items in the market basket of goods, which is determined by the Consumer Expenditure Survey. So, what in order to figure out what is in the market basket of goods for this CPI, then we are going to have this thing called the Consumer Expenditure Survey. That's what it's called. And then all of this data is combined with the quantities in the market basket to calculate the cost of purchasing all this bundle. And so it also is expressed in an index number to show the relative cost of that bundle that they looked at in the base year. So we're trying to look at what is the relative cost for the for the bundle relative to that base year that we set earlier. Remember, the base year is the year that we're basing our prices on in real GDP. And so we can take a look at figure 39 here, where we see that pants, t-shirts, and shoes are in the consumption bundle here. Two pairs of pants, three t-shirts, and one pair of shoes are all included. So if we use 2015 as this base year that we set, and then if we set the cost of the bundle in this year to equal to 100, then we can calculate the CPI by the formula 100 times the cost of the bundle in year T divided by the cost of the bundle in the base year. And so this is probably well demonstrated right here in the in the little chart here. So if we take a look, we have the cost in the new year where 2014 is the index. It's the base year of 100 and then cost of 60. So we know that overall we have, as it said, we have cost of the bundle in year T divided by the cost of the bundle in the base year. And so we know the bundle is 71 and then 60. So 71 divided by 60 times 100 is going to be this CPI right here. And so we can see here that the CPI overall is just going to be the cost. Now, an important thing to note about CPI here is that the quantities of the bundle determine the impact of the price changes for each item in the overall index. So because there's a purchase of three t-shirts and one pair of shoes, the price of t-shirts causes a larger change in CPI than the equivalent dollar increase in the price of shoes. So overall, if we look at this little chart some more, we see that this bundle right here is very important. This is the quantities in the base year. So for example, this would be in 2014. So it's very important that you're multiplying the prices in the given year that you're trying to calculate the CPI by the quantity of the bundle divided by the cost in the base year times the quantity in the bundle, of course, times 100 in order to get your little CPI index there. And so, oh dear, we can see that CPI is very important for understanding our economy. And so, one example of this is Social Security. Each year, its benefit payments are meant to reflect the changes in the cost of living reflected by CPI specifically. So, we can see that CPI, okay, how much is the cost of living for this bundle of goods that we're assuming the typical consumer will consume? And so, additionally, union employment contracts use the cost of living adjustments that tie wage increases to the CPI overall. And employers and employees, they take into account the CPI changes when they're adjusting wage rates. And so if they're adjusting those wages based on CPI, because it's showing the cost to live. And so once again, the goal of CPI is to show those changes in price affecting the ability of households maintaining the level they enjoyed in the base year. So how how much is the price increasing for uh, a given basket of goods here? And so we can see that CPI, although this is its goal, actually measures how the changes in price affect the cost of the fixed bundle. And so this means that actually CPI is overstating the true increase in the cost of living. So there's an upward bias in the CPI overall. There is a bias that causes the price to look higher than it actually is here. So let's go ahead and explain what each of the factors for the upward bias in CPI are. So the first one is the substitution bias. So households usually shift their consumption away from the expensive goods and services towards less expensive ones. So if price of beef increases, then families will consume more chicken and airline prices decline, consumers fly more and drive less. And so they're adjusting this consumption towards less expensive goods. And so they can have the same well-being at a cost lower than the cost of buying at that fixed basket. Because a fixed basket says, oh, they're not going to change their preferences because this is what we've seen in our little consumer survey, our little Bureau of Labor Statistics consumer expenditure survey. So we could be substituting for other goods that are cheaper, and thus the market basket is saying we are actually consuming more than what actually is being consumed. Then another upward bias factor is the unmeasured quality change. And so since a lot of goods and services get better over time from technological change, we can see that the quality improvement would ex be expected to raise the price of the goods. And so the comparison of prices between 1 year and the next will overstate the increase or understate any decline in prices here. So, in its essence, because we have this fixed basket of goods, and that basket of goods will typically have a price increase from a quality improvement, we can't exactly say that we're accurately estimating a lower or a higher cost of living and therefore a lower quality of life because we have better quality in the goods. And so even though BLS statisticians try and show, oh, these quality changes are happening, it's hard to remove them from CPI. And then the third reason CPI overestimates this true rate of inflation is because of new goods and services. So, for example, cell phones in the mid 1970s. Mobile communication was unavailable at any price to most consumers, but because they didn't exist, the market basket used by the BLS did not include them to calculate CPI. And during their years of development, their prices fell very rapidly and their quality of service improved. But because they weren't included in CPI, none of the effects were shown in inflation. And so we aren't actually showing how new goods are being included in CPI. And then only once they had a large market penetration were they able to be added to the CPI basket. So one estimate of how much the CPI is overstating the price was done by the Boskin Commission, which was headed by economist Michael Boskin in 1996. He reviewed the methods of CPI and the combined effects of substitution bias, quality improvement, and introduction of new goods. So remember, those are the three different factors that create an upward bias in CPI. And he found, and the company found, or the whatever Boston Commission is, found that the rate of price inflation was overstated by 1.3% each year. And so this is just one way that economists are able to measure those changes in the cost of living. And so we also are able to look at, okay, how else are we able to look at price of living? Well, we can use the GDP deflator. And so the relationship between the real and nominal GDP actually shows a different perspective on inflation as a whole. And so this is the GDP deflator is nominal GDP equals the GDP deflator times real GDP all divided by 100. So this makes sense because nominal GDP then is going to be adjusted by real GDP by multiplying by this deflator number, which will be in this case factoring in to account inflation back into real GDP to make it into nominal GDP. And so GDP deflator is an index number, just like a CPI, and we can multiply real GDP by the index in order to get the nominal GDP. And so we can also show that the GDP deflator is equal to 100 times the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP. And so if we look at figure 40, we can see the difference between the measure of the CPI and the GDP deflator all the way back since the 1960s. And so they show a lot of different stories about the cost of living, and it shows that the GDP deflator is less volatile, and so it rises at less peaks and decelerates at less low points. So as you can see, it's a little less extreme than the CPI here. So at first they were very similar from 1960 all the way up to like 78 or 79 or so. Then they started to diverge. So this was a bit of a more spike increase, whereas this was less. And so we can see then that over the period since the 1960s, the GDP deflator has risen somewhat less than the CPI overall. Now, what makes these differences is our question, and that will be that the GDP deflator only shows the prices of domestically produced goods. And so foreign produced goods have a larger role in the CPI market basket. And so the differences in behavior of purchasing foreign goods will show up in the differences of the two indexes. So I'm going to say that again. The first difference is that GDP deflator only shows domestically produced goods. And the foreign produced goods will have a larger role in the CPI market basket. And with those differences in mind, that's a big factor of how the differences show up between the GDP deflator and the CPI. And another reason why CPI in the end of the 1970s rose more than the GDP deflator is because of rising oil prices. So rising oil prices, and they had this large effect on CPI. But it was mainly produced overseas, and so it did not affect the GDP deflator as much as it did the CPI. And then the next reason why the GDP deflator and CPI diverge is how they actually weigh those prices in different goods and services. So the CPI used a fixed market basket, whereas the GDP deflators looks at prices at their current levels of production. So GDP deflator is looking at the current production multiplied or looking at how the real GDP, remember, is the quantity in the given year multiplied by the price of the base year. Whereas CPI is that quantity of the base year times the price of the given year. And so we can see that there's a difference here. And real GDP is going to relate to the GDP deflator because the nominal GDP will have that deflator multiplied by the real GDP. And so, because of this, the basket of goods used to weigh prices in the GDP deflator adjusts to changing consumption patterns over time. So the GDP deflator takes into account more the changing goods that are being consumed versus just a fixed market basket based on a base year. Okay, so then we get to discuss some unemployment. And so macroeconomists can not only use production and GDP in order to understand the state of an economy, but also the unemployment rate. So this is important for understanding how an economy is performing. It's a sensitive indicator, in fact. And when unemployment rate is low, as you would assume, workers are feeling secure in their jobs, and there's competition that helps drive up wages. And however, when unemployment is high, so less people are being hired, then workers will worry about losing their jobs. And so, if we were to formally define the unemployment rate, it's defined as the percentage of the labor force that is unable to find a job. Now, we need to know what is this labor force here. It is all the working age adults who are either employed or actively seeking work. So, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, again, just like the guys who produced the CPI, is responsible for measuring this unemployment rate. And so, they survey 60,000 households based on a series of questions to put different people in different categories of employment. So anyone 16 years or older. And so this will include people that are that are employed, unemployed, or out of the workforce. So this is the person received pay for a full or part-time during the previous week, or is on vacation or sick leave from a regular job. And then unemployed is when a person did not work during the previous week, but made some effort to find paid employment in the last 4 weeks. So 4 weeks is the unemployment little status here. If they've been making an effort within the past 4 weeks, but they haven't had work in the past week, then they're unemployed. Then there's out of the workforce, labor force. It's those people who want to sit at home and play video games all day. Or it's the people who want to sit at home and study academic all day. So I would definitely recommend the academic one, probably over the video game one. But the if the person had not sought work during the past week and did not work during the past week and did not actively seek work during the past 4 weeks, they're out of the labor force. They don't get to be part of this special little collection of the labor force here. And so these three categories are all the working age population, all those people above age 16 or older. And so employed plus unemployed equals the labor force. And we know that the unemployment rate is the quantity of people unemployed expressed as a percentage of the labor force. So unemployment divided by employment plus unemployment. And so we can see in figure 41 all of this data about the labor force and unemployment in July of 2020, and we see that there are approximately 260 million working age persons in the United States. And of these, there are 160 million that are in the workforce. And then the ratio of that labor force to the working age population is called the labor force participation rate, which currently, or as of July 2020, 61.4%. And then those in the labor force, about 143.5 million had jobs, while 16.3 million were unemployed. So we can see this is an unemployment rate of 10.2% in July of 2020. Now, this is actually a significantly higher unemployment rate, and this is due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we can see labor force participation rate and the unemployment rate are two very different things. Labor force participation rate is uh, how many people are working out of all the people that could be working. Um, and the unemployment rate is those unemployed out of those who are in the labor force. And so, actually, a year earlier, before July 2020, it was actually only at 3.4%. And it's because of the COVID-19 pandemic that caused this. We all know there were a lot of jobs that were on the line. Now, another very important thing to note is that The unemployment rate is highest among teenage population, and it varies by race, ethnicity, and gender. So this unemployment rate is different for different people. And so why are people unemployed is a question that we need to think about. And there are three broad categories that economists can look into for unemployment. And the first is frictional unemployment. So, frictional unemployment, the idea behind this is that there are a lot of workers who either choose or do not choose to leave their jobs, and then more are hired. And so, because of the job searching taking time, there are brief times where some people are unemployed. And so, frictional unemployment is this idea of people who are not matched to their employers right away. It's because of that time gap of you need to find your job and the employers need to find the employees. And so, this is also as a result of new workers entering the labor force. They haven't worked the previous week, but are just entering the labor force. And so, how about before we move on, we should probably look at this chart. We can see that the non-institutional population, so this is all the people who are not in jail, and then the civilian labor force. All of the, this is the labor force participation rate is that 159,870 divided by 263,703, as we can see, as said right above here. And so that is our labor force participation rate, whereas the 16,000 here, 338 out of the sum of these two. So that's going to be just around 160,000 if I'm just estimating. So here we had a 10% rate in 2020. And so then we can also look at some unemployment rate of percentages and how they differ among different people. So total is 10.2. Adult men was one of the lowest with 9.4. And then white was 9.2. And then women, it was 10.5. Teenagers, 19.3. Clearly the highest unemployment rate here. Black or African American is the next highest unemployment. Then we had Asian and Hispanic or Latino ethnicity. So clearly we have differing unemployment rates for different people. Then we have, let's talk about structural unemployment. So structural unemployment is the is based on characteristics. So structural unemployment is all based on those job seekers who may have different skills than what a lot of employers at that time that they are looking for a job may need. So if a job seeker, for example, is looking for a person who has really old skills in, say, using a typewriter. We have a lot more people who have skills in using instead like a computer to type out documents. And so there's this mismatch between the skills of the workers and the skills that are needed for the jobs. And so this is an example of structural unemployment. So there's this mismatch between job openings and job seekers. And so an example of this would be 1980s steel industry was contracting. So the steel industry was sinking. So a lot of people had steel skills, but the computer industry was booming. And so workers, they were located in the industrial northeast of the expanding Sunbelt industries. They were had to be laid off because the steel industry was declining, and so they lacked the skills to pursue those jobs of in computer industries. And then, as well, when self-driving vehicles begin to replace Uber drivers, then that may result in structurally unemployed people because of automation and the changes in the structure of the economy as a whole. So you would need skills in more like making those self-driving vehicles rather than being the drivers. And then there's cyclical unemployment, which is where we have during recessions, this is when cyclical unemployment happens. So you're gonna the an indication of a recession in an economy is actually cyclical unemployment. Structural unemployment and frictional unemployment are bound to happen almost regardless. But cyclical unemployment happens under the case of recessions. So we can say that if there's cyclical unemployment, then we have layoffs, increase, new hires decline. And so it's harder to seek employment because it's harder to do these things. And lots of people are spending more time searching for work, all because of this recession here. So I hope you really enjoyed this econ video. And I hope you found it helpful. Next up, we're going to be going over economic growth, productivity, and living standards. So stay tuned for that.